Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Claude Lafayette Dallas is considered by many a living embodiment of the American West. Even his name rings of a Wild West novel, a name teeming with outlaw bravado, conjuring images of a lone cowboy wandering the desert, surviving off his wits and the fat of the land. But this is no fictional cowboy. Claude Dallas is the real deal. A buckaroo and trapper, a modern-day outlaw, and cold-blooded murderer. But did he kill out of necessity? Or was it a sense of Wild West justice? Or was it some sick, sociopathic need for control and dominance? Is Claude Dallas a psychopath or heroic gatekeeper of the pioneer's spirit? You tell us. This is his story.
Let's begin. Prologue. The Mountain Man. It was January 5th, 1981, and Jim Stevens was excited. Jim was an Idaho potato farmer, what the local cowboys and ranchers called a spud person, tied to the land and domesticated, but like many in the wild and rural southwestern parts of Idaho, what they called the Ion region, as it is where Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada meet, Jim had a great admiration for mountain men.
Mountain men, those rugged hunters and trappers that could more than live off the land, but thrive off of it. Jim was a bit of a history buff and a romantic, and that image of the American West, Jeremiah Johnson, Daniel Boone, Grizzly Adams, buckskinners and muzzleloaders, was an endless fascination to him. And to his delight, Jim Stevens was friends with an actual modern-day mountain man, Claude Dallas.
Claude Dallas was like something out of a Wild West novel. He could easily walk 40 miles in a day. An ex-cowboy and now a trapper by trade who knew livestock and animals, could shoe a horse, brand a cow, deliver a calf, but was also a survivalist who knew everything about the forests, canyons, mountains, and hills. How to survive by licking dew off leaves in the morning, which plants were edible and which were poisonous.
And Claude was an outlaw who dodged the draft and didn't believe man's laws affected him as he lived outside of society, hunting for his food and wildcrafting. He didn't need society and therefore didn't pay taxes. Didn't follow hunting and trapping laws, poaching deer and trapping out of season using illegal bait.
But always the dichotomy. Claude was also the most honest man you could ever meet. Jim thought him incapable of telling a lie. It was against his very nature. He was soft-spoken, kind, good-natured, a gentle soul who didn't drink or fight.
Dallas had a bit of a hippie to him. Longish hair he kept in a ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses, a draft dodger, nonconformist, back-to-the-earth, nature lover.
In the winter of 1980 and 1981, Dallas was trapping, camping, and overwintering in the deepest and most rugged part of Ion Country, a place called Bull Camp, down the Owyhee River, a no-man's land over 6 hours down desolate dirt roads.
The camp had been abandoned in the late 1800s, and pioneer artifacts still remained. Tuscarora mountain miners who had once wintered their cattle there, and one could still find wagon wheels and hand-wrought square nails.
Before that, native tribes had wandered there, and before them, their prehistoric ancestors, Paleo-Indians hunting herds of woolly mammoth. A pottery shard found in a cave there was carbon dated at 10,000 BC.
That's wild, over 12,000 years ago.
And Jim was excited because he was going to go out into the deepest realms of the mountains to bring his friends supplies. He'd brought his metal detector and was hoping to find some relics. He'd seen wagon wheels and arrowheads already. What would he find next? An axe head? A gold doubloon?
As arranged, after arriving at Bull Camp in his four-wheel drive Blazer packed with supplies, Jim fired off his rifle twice in a row to let Claude know he was there.
When Claude came slinking out of the forest where he'd been inspecting his trap lines, he immediately asked Jim for fruit, saying he'd eaten nothing but venison for weeks.
Fruit, Jim said. Well, I got fruit of all kind, a whole cooler of oranges. I even got pistachio pudding and brownies baked by the wife.
We're going to have a good time, Claude Dallas told him. A real good time.
To many, including Dallas himself, Bull Camp seemed like the last of the untamed great American desert. One of the few places a man could go to hunt and trap and be completely alone in raw wilderness. But the truth was, there was really no completely untamed wilderness left in the United States by 1980. There were other trappers who'd visit Bull Camp, as well as a family of ranchers who'd run their cows down into the valley during the winter to drink from the river. And they'd all seen Dallas. From a mile away, they could look through the scope of a rifle and see his little tent with the wood stove chimney burping smoke. And they'd seen his traps, set weeks before the bobcat season started, and used an illegal bait as well.
Word had gotten out in that slow and meandering way, and now even Fish and Game were on to Claude Dallas, and were preparing to pay him a little visit. A warden named Bill Pogue, who'd crossed paths with Claude Dallas before.
Though they'd never met in person, Pogue had come across one of Claude's trapping camps once in Paradise Valley, and had left his business card, writing ominously on the back, "I'll check on you later."
Claude, who believed in complete personal freedom, considered himself outside of the law, a survivalist and pioneer. He found the note downright rude and thought it stunk of authoritarianism.
As fate would have it, on the same day that Jim Stevens was bringing supplies out to his friend, game warden Bill Pogue was also coming to check on Claude, bringing along another game warden for backup, 6'2", 250-pound warden Conley Elms.
Jim had wandered down by the river, scoping for relics, while Dallas hauled in supplies, when Jim heard a shout and looked over to see Claude by his tent, talking to the two game wardens.
Jim wandered over. The older warden, Bill Pogue, in a Stetson hat, demanded Jim hand over his pistol, which he did. The younger, very large and bearded Warden Elms hung back watching, and Jim wondered if he wasn't a trainee.
Jim, who was a congenial guy, smiled and tried to make small talk with them, asking how far away the Nevada state line was. The wardens didn't smile back, Bill Pogue scowling.
Warden Pogue began to question Claude about the deer carcasses hanging beside his tent, saying deer season was over.
Claude Dallas calmly and politely told him a man's gotta eat. He was 100 miles from the nearest store and would starve if he didn't hunt.
Pogue then began asking what was in Dallas's tent, saying he already knew about the bobcat skins and that bobcat season didn't start for another couple weeks, and he may have to arrest him.
Jim was taken aback. Arrest him? It was just a ticket with a $130 fine. Hardly an arrestable crime. What were they even doing out here in the middle of nowhere?
Claude calmly told the warden that he'd tell the judge he'd caught the bobcats in Nevada, where the season had already started, and they'd need a search warrant to enter his tent. He then told the wardens he couldn't be arrested as he had livestock here, 2 mules who would starve, and all his equipment and his tent. What would happen to it all?
Meanwhile, the younger, larger game warden just went into the tent, shouting, "There's a raccoon pelt here, too!" before emerging with the evidence. 2 bobcat hides and a raccoon.
Jim says he turned for a moment to look at the river, dumbfounded by the whole situation. Heard Claude say, "Are you going to take me in then?" And then the first shots rang out.
Jim turned in time to see Game Warden Bill Pogue say, "Oh no!" a curl of smoke rising from his chest as he fell backwards, his pistol in his hand.
Claude then swung and began to fire at Elms, hitting him multiple times, then back on Pogue, firing at each of them until he'd emptied his .357 revolver of bullets. He then ducked into his tent, retrieving a .22 lever-action rifle, went to Bill Pogue, who lay twitching slightly on the desert floor, put the barrel behind his ear, trapper style, and fired.
Claude Dallas then went to Game Warden Elms and did the same thing, just as you'd do to an animal you'd trapped and want to put out of its misery, putting the muzzle behind his ear and firing.
Then it got all weird. Dallas used his mules to drag Warden Elms down to the river, face first, the dead game warden losing his pants and shirt in the brush along the way, Claude then pushing his naked body into the icy water. He then loaded Warden Bill Pogue, his nemesis, into Jim's blazer, the tall warden's feet hanging out the window, and drove him back over the hours and hours of long dirt roads and to the Paradise Bar, showing the corpse off to the bar's owner as if it was some exotic and elusive animal he managed to hunt down.
The murder of these 2 game wardens would lead to a 15-month manhunt, headed by the FBI and involving nearly every type of law enforcement known, including the National Guard, that extended to every state and into Canada, and would tear communities apart, as some saw the killings as a man pushed to the edge by government regulations and over-enforcement of trivial laws, and others saw him as a sociopathic cop killer.
What unfolded was an unbelievably wild tale of the modern American West, with insane shootouts, car chases through the desert, jailbreaks, So buckle up, partner, and let's get this tale of a modern-day Wild West outlaw going.
Chapter 1. Little Claude.
Claude Lafayette Dallas, Jr. was born March 11th, 1950, in Winchester, Virginia, named after his father, who worked as a chemical engineer for Firestone, the second of 6 sons and a girl. That's one big family. Claude's mother, Jenny, says about him,
He was skinny at birth, the only skinny baby I had, and his nose looked big like his daddy's.
So, as Claude Sr. says, I took one look at him and I told her, well, that's Junior.
Claude Sr. was a rugged, old-school individualist who believed in independence and had a natural disdain for big government rules and regulations. Looking for an isolated place to raise his children, he moved the family to a dairy farm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. As he says,
It was the poorest farming country I ever seen. Under snow 7-8 months out of the year. Didn't get but one day of cutting hay. I'd put Will on the mower and Bill on the rake and Claude on the baler. It'd do your heart good to see me out in the field with them 3 little kids. We had 120 brown Swiss, and the only way we kept the farm going was to work the family for nothing. We had a milker and a field hand. The milker milked one side of the barn, and my boys the other.
Claude Sr. claims he, quote,
Never had to whip my boys. Claude never had a whipping. I did when I was a kid. It's useless.
But Mom Jenny Dallas says, he just forgets. He hit 'em, sure he hit 'em. My job was to bring them up right and give them love. Claude was stern enough for the 2 of us.
When Claude Jr. was just 6 years old, his father bought him his first horse, an Oklahoma cutting horse, part quarter, part Arabian, named Blue Roan, telling him, when you come back from being thrown, you better have a piece of the bridle or something to show you tried to hold on to him. Don't come back empty-handed.
3 years later, when little Claude was 9, his father would find the horse coming back to the barn, and Claude stumbling behind it, a broken bridle clutched in his hand, battered and bruised, from where he'd held on as the horse tried to buck him off through the forest. His father had him get back on the horse and ride it to the barn.
And that year, Claude Sr. gave his namesake son his first gun, a 16-gauge double-barreled shotgun, soon followed by a 30-06 hunting rifle.
The dairy farm struggled to survive, and the large family lived on venison and wild game, anything they could manage to kill. Squirrel, raccoon, possum, Canadian geese by the dozens.
Sometimes the justice of the peace, who enforced the game laws, would work on their dairy farm, and he was always sure to stay well away from the woodshed where they butchered, respectfully making sure not to see something he shouldn't.
Claude shot his first deer at 12 years old, and of course, it was out of season. Poaching was survival. As Claude Sr. said,
Well, we ate venison and anything else we could kill. Either that or go hungry.
During hunting season, they'd sell racks and deer heads to unsuccessful hunters who wanted a trophy to bring home.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And Claude trapped as well, going out alone into the snow-covered forest to lay his lines, bringing home a mink pelt for his mother, when he was just a child and making a scarf out of it.
Claude Sr. says,
I don't know if I'm gonna have any earthly possessions to leave my kids when I'm dead and gone, but I figured if I left the world of work and knowledge that they should be honest, then I'd done the best I could for them. That's worth more than money.
Eventually, the family moved to a dairy farm in Ohio, but Claude forever loved the wildness of the upper plains of Michigan. Ohio felt tame and subdued. He longed for that feeling of isolation and ruggedness.
Claude had a staggering IQ of 163, and he did very well at Mount Gilead High School. He was quiet and polite, and his teachers all pressured him to pursue higher learning, to go to college and beyond. But he craved nature and outdoors, not sitting in a classroom. He longed to go west, into the mountains, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevadas, travel the wilds of America, Northern California, Oregon, Idaho, Nevada.
For his senior picture, Claude Dallas wore an old-fashioned Western tie that he had hand-ironed himself, a docile and studious-looking figure in wire-rimmed glasses.
It was 1968, and the Vietnam War was steadily escalating. And 18-year-old Claude Dallas was drafted into military service. Now, like anything involving Claude Dallas, there are different versions of this story. True crime writer Jack Olson investigated this case thoroughly, conducted a lot of interviews, got to know the people. He's a fabulous writer. We've used his books as main sources in other episodes, like on Dean Corll and Keith Jesperson. So according to Jack Olson in his book, Give a Boy a Gun, a true story of law and disorder in the American West, Claude Dallas received his draft card and then went on the lam, became an outlaw. But according to Jeff Long, in his book, Outlaw, the true story of Claude Dallas, the draft card got lost in the mail while Claude was traveling and his parents were moving to South Carolina. And Claude never received it and didn't even know about it. But I honestly tend to believe Jack Olson, as he interviewed folks who said Claude told them he was well aware of the draft card and was on the run.
But either way, Claude Dallas was now a wanted man, the FBI being alerted of his failure to report for service. They took this very seriously back then, and whether he realized it or not, for the first but not the last time in his life, Claude Dallas was an outlaw.
Claude Sr. signed over the pink slip to his 1941 international pickup to his namesake son, and Claude drove south out of Ohio, seeing the country. At some point, he lost the truck and just started hitchhiking west, reaching one of his sisters in San Jose, California, and working on a dairy farm there.
He drifted about, part hippie, part Western renegade, part beatnik, part hobo, a very Americana Jack Kerouac existence, in search of the elusive American frontier and Wild West.
Sleeping in an orange grove in Exeter, California, on the edge of the Sequoia National Park, an old-timer there told Claude the most beautiful place on earth was a ranch out in eastern Oregon called Alvord, a place so desolate it felt like another planet. He said they were always in need of work, folks to mend fences and help run the cattle. He said it was where Claude could find the most authentic experience of the Western frontier.
And so Claude Dallas slung on his backpack and headed out, hitchhiking north out of California on Interstate 5, over Mount Shasta and into Oregon, in search of the authentic American West. It was 1969, and he was 18 years old.
Chapter 2. The Alvord Ranch.
Once he reached Burns, Oregon, it took Claude 2 days to walk 70 miles through the rain to the isolated 300,000-acre Alvord Ranch. The ranch was part of the historical Basque cowboy culture of the area.
Basque people started coming to California from their home in the Pyrenees Mountains in the 1850s during the gold rush, and are regarded as the founders of sheep herding in the area, establishing the buckaroo cowboy culture.
They asked Claude what he knew about running fences. He told them not much, but he could learn, as long as he didn't have to milk a cow. He never wanted to do that again.
They gave him a week's work mending fences. He finished in 2 days. They sent him atop a lonely, windswept mountain, and he worked it without a complaint.
He did the jobs no one else wanted to, and he did them well. He did chores he wasn't even asked to, like digging and building a new outhouse.
Claude told them he'd always wanted to be a buckaroo and studied the Basque cowboy ways and traditions. An eager student, for 2 years he used his 165 IQ and learned how to birth a calf, how to castrate and dehorn a bull, how to shoe horses and give injections, how to rope and brand without going through the hide.
He learned the 200-year-old vaquero words, like orana for an unbranded cow on the loose, tapaderes for the ornate leather covers over stirrups, and riata for a braided rawhide.
He learned how to treat cows who'd eat poisonous larkspur, to cut a slit below their tails to let the thick black blood ooze out in lumps and drips. He bought a high-back saddle with a horn for roping, and sewed his own chaps.
Claude was the perfect employee and ranch hand. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't curse, didn't fight or cause trouble, didn't go to town on payday and blow his money on liquor and prostitutes and end up in the drunk tank. He was reliable, dependable, honest as the day is long.
But at the end of 2 years, he told them he was a wanted man, that the draft board was after him and he had to keep on moving. When asked about being drafted, he stated he'd fight for his country. All he wanted was to be asked nicely. But no one was ordering him around. That was not the American way.
He bought 2 buckskin horses and loaded them with provisions. When asked where he was going, he pointed toward the distant Sierra Nevada mountains and rode off into the sunset.
He rode through the high plains of the Great Basin and into the Great American Desert, which includes Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and California. Going from ranch to ranch, job to job, this tall, flat-brimmed cowboy hat and handmade tapaderas, oversized silver spurs jangling from his high-heeled boots.
He crossed into Nevada and down into the Oahe Desert, which Washington Irving had called the ruins of the world. Camping by abandoned silver mines, crossing the Fernley Sink salt flat, so white it burned one's eyes in the gleaming sun.
Eventually, he settled into the Paradise Valley, a 40-mile-long by 12-mile-wide stretch of high desert where he found work on the 2-million-acre Nevada Garvey Ranch.
By this time, he'd grown his hair out and wore it in a ponytail, which irked some of the more conservative cowboys like Cortland Nielsen, who says of the newcomer,
"His hair was long, shoulder length, and in this good book here, the Bible, it says that long hair is a woman's beauty, and it's filth on man." I told Clyde too. In cowboy country, long hairs get barbered with sheep shears.
But despite the long hair, he was accepted and liked in Paradise Valley, beloved in fact. Yet a few did notice a coldness to him. He was hard on animals. If a dog growled at him, he'd hit him with a stick, once knocking a Labrador out cold.
A stallion caused him trouble and he attacked it with a hammer. Had to be pulled off.
Jeez, that's quite psychotic. He was also completely contemptuous of the game laws, one of his fellow buckaroos later saying,
"He sees nothing wrong with shooting any animal, anytime. He'll drag in a young deer or an antelope and leave it at the chuck wagon. Well, we have all the prime beef we want, and the wild meat, it just goes to waste. And it puts us on the spot, too. Government men and game wardens, they're always dropping into camp."
Chapter 3. Busted.
Every cowboy, he always misses when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land. And I've been thinking about running, and I'll get out on.
In the fall of 1973, the FBI were hot on the trail of Claude Dallas, who was now 23 and had been running from the draft for 4 years. They tracked him from Ohio to New York, all the way to Oregon and the Alvord Ranch. And in November, they made their way into Idaho to Paradise Valley.
Every cowboy, he always misses his shot when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land.
Posing as buckaroos looking for work, 2 FBI agents went to the Nevada Garvey Ranch, wearing cowboy boots and dusty Levi's, strolling up to a bunkhouse and saying, "You're Dallas, ain't ya?"
When he confirmed yes, they drew their weapons on him, then handcuffed him and led him away, stuffing them into their car and whisking him away from paradise.
Yeah, I've gotta leave this town to find my way. And when that
With nowhere else to put him, they tossed him into the drunk tank in Reno, a bunch of criminals, then handed him over to U.S. Marshals, who belly shackled, manacled, and handcuffed him, then marched him through airports and into dingy jail cells.
He was shoved, punched, roughed up, and called a traitor to his country, an experience he'd never forget or forgive.
To a man who cherished his freedom and independence, it was horrible. But eventually, the case was dismissed due to improper procedures by the Mount Gilead Draft Board. But before releasing him, an FBI agent whispered to him, quote, "I'm gonna get you, Dallas, even if it's for tax evasion." Claude took it as a genuine threat.
By early 1974, Claude Dallas was back in Paradise Valley, saying the FBI wouldn't have taken him if they hadn't got the drop on him first by being sneaky and dishonest, and that no one would ever outdraw him again. No one.
After that, Dallas was never seen without a gun on his hip again. He worked with a gun, ate with a gun, even slept with a gun.
sitting here, 'cause I've been thinking that all this thinking is the thing that keeps me further from myself.
Chapter 4. George Nielsen.
The gentle April rain that stained the window panes last night is all but gone, but lingers on in scented clouds of air. We watch the
Though he didn't really drink beside the occasional beer, Claude started spending time in the Paradise Hill bar, usually just sipping on a grapefruit juice, enraptured with the larger-than-life owner, George Nielsen, who became a father figure of sorts to the young buckaroo.
George came to Paradise from Los Angeles as a cattle merchant, buying herds so large they called him Train Car. He bought the bar after getting into an automobile accident and marrying his Irish nurse, Liz. But he still loved buying and selling livestock, as well as pelts, furs, taxidermies, whatever he could get his hands on, and carried the spirit of the Wild West.
George drank early times whiskey mixed with 7-Up, nearly non-stop all day. Could polish off 20 of them. Claims he could outdrink and outfuck any man around. He worked his bar and served drinks with pistols hanging from his belt, and was a storyteller full of bravado. In many ways, the opposite of quiet, sober Claude, who would grow red in the face at the mention of sex, and always respectfully called any woman he met, ma'am.
But they were deeply bonded over their love of the American West, the culture of cowboys and mountain men, freedom, self-reliance, and independence, as well as a hatred of government regulations, and what they saw as superfluous laws that trampled a man's right to liberty and freedom.
George and Liz were like a new set of parents to Claude, and by 1976, Claude was living in a trailer behind their bar.
And Claude had had enough of being a buckaroo. Now he was going back to his roots as a trapper to make a living.
Bobcat pelts were going for $200 a pop. Good money for the late 70s. And Claude began to lay traps throughout southeastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho, and especially northern Nevada, camping in the mountains and hills, the Tuscareros, Santa Rosas, bull runs, and snowstorms, traveling by foot the old-fashioned way, making camp, collecting pelts, and moving on to the next place.
But he thought nothing of using illegal bait like jackrabbit fur and bones, and he didn't use spacers. Eagles and hawks have hollow legs, so if they get caught in a trap without spacers, it will crush their legs, crippling them. For some reason, this didn't bother Claude.
Claude would also shoot wild mustangs, both for bait for his traps and food for himself, which was incredibly illegal and frowned on, with a stiff $1,000 fine.
The Wild Horse Act of 1971 brought horses under federal protection, saying, quote, "Wild, free, roaming horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West." But again, Claude just didn't care, saying wild horses were some of the best-tasting meat in the desert, and man has to eat.
Claude Dallas would wander out into the vast Ion country and be gone for long periods of time, then return to his trailer behind the Paradise Bar, where George would buy all his pelts.
At one point, Claude ran into Nevada Field and Game agent Dale Elliott, who fined him for using illegal bait, but says he found Claude to be very polite and cooperative, reasonable.
Yet Claude told his friends if he'd been caught with illegal cougar pelts, and not just illegal bait, he may have had to kill the game warden, adding, "It'd be fun to be on the run, going from one cache of weapons to the next and fighting it out."
His friend Hoyt Wilson says, "Claude had a funny sort of philosophy about trapping animals. He'd go into an area and survey it, check the cat sign and coyote sign, decide how many animals he was going to take and take them. Then he'd move on. He'd say, 'I'm a better conservationist than the fish and game. I don't know why they bother me.'"
Trapping in the bloody runs there in Paradise, Claude ran into a few game wardens, but again was always polite, invited them into his tent for tea. One warden left a business card for him at one of his camps, scrawling on the back, "I'll check on you later," which irked Claude. Didn't seem friendly. That warden's name was Bill Pogue.
Claude traveled, going on adventures, hunting and trapping in Canada, up into the Yukon, and Alaska, always returning to Paradise Valley, and George and Liz Nielsen, who were like parents to him. George would sell his pelts and let him use his battered old school bus to drive out to the distant mountains and camp, trap, and canoe.
In the summer of 1980, Claude canoed down the Oihe River into Bull Basin, an extremely desolate area on the Idaho-Nevada border, and made camp in a place called Bull Camp, vowing to return later that year and spend the entire winter there, to prove himself by overwintering in the most desolate place in the continental United States.
Chapter 5, Bull Camp.
Just above the Nevada border, nestled between the Fort McDermott Indian Reservation in Oregon and the Duck Valley Reservation in Idaho, is Bull Camp, located on a section of land owned by the government, overseen by the Bureau of Land Management.
It's in a place called Oihe, named after 3 Hawaiian trappers who entered the area in 1819 and were never seen again.
Claude called it the most uninhabited and remote piece of land in Ion country, and told George Nielsen how he wanted to spend the winter there, trapping bobcat. And George told him he'd be happy to take him there himself and see it.
So on Wednesday, December 3rd, 1980, George and his son, as well as local potato farmer and part-time historian Jim Stevens, and a few other Paradise Valley locals, loaded up tents, tarps, traps, and provisions to drive Claude out the 6 hours of bumpy, unmaintained dirt roads to Bull Camp.
It was a convoy of pickup trucks, George's little school bus, Jim's Blazer, and a Chevy Suburban pulling a trailer with 2 mules that Claude was going to use to haul supplies while trapping during the winter.
Everyone thought it was so Claude to use a pair of mules to trap with, carrying on in the traditional way of the mountain man.
It was a grueling 6-hour trek over rutted roads and washes as they penetrated deeper and deeper into the desolate desert, over roads that had been taken by men in search of gold, outlaws, runaway slaves, Civil War deserters, vagabonds, and dreamers, none of whom managed to last very long.
It was snowing when they made it to Bull Camp, a small flat beside the river with 2 crumbling stone cabins, the ancient ruins of a stagecoach axle and wheel. They unloaded the mules, dropped off the supplies, and then it was time to head back.
The men felt odd leaving Claude behind in the snow in one of the most rugged places on earth. He looked tiny as they headed up the mountain pass, waving at them as the snow tumbled down.
But Claude was in his element. He constructed his tent on a small bluff, raised up so as to not get flooded, equipped it with a wood-burning stove to keep it warm and cozy.
He quickly took down a few deer and had meat hanging, and then laid out his trap lines, snagging a couple of bobcats.
But he felt like he was being watched. And he was.
The 45 ranch, run by the Carlin family, was 12 miles away, and they'd bring their cows into Bull Camp during the winter. They also set traps on the land. While Bull Basin was BLM land, they considered it part of their ranch. They noticed Claude Dallas and his traps nearly right away, seeing the thin stream of smoke burping up from his wood stove chimney.
On New Year's Day, 1981, Eddie Carlin decided to investigate and rode his horse the 4 hours from 45 Ranch to Bull Basin, finding Claude beside the Owyhee River. He introduced himself, and Claude invited him to have tea in his tent.
Eddie was surprised to see 2 bobcat skins being stretched. It was still nearly 2 weeks until bobcat season opened. There were also 3 deer hanging, which seemed a ridiculous amount of meat for just one man. Not to mention, deer season was long over.
Both men were openly armed, and it was a little tense. As they sipped their tea, they talked about hunting and trapping. Then, delicately, the idea of territory was brought up, and they made a gentleman's agreement that Claude would only run his traps north of Coyote Springs.
Eddie told Claude Fish and Game would probably be by, and Claude told him he'd be ready for them if they did. Eddie also told him he was not the kind of guy who'd turn someone in and rat them out to Fish and Game.
And he wasn't, but his wife was. When she heard what was going on with Claude Dallas running traps out of season with illegal bait down in Bull Camp, she told the game warden, Bill Pogue, all about it.
So did some other trappers as well.
So game warden Bill Pogue, a tough, no-nonsense man and dedicated conservationist, decided to investigate this trapper that had shown up in Bull Camp. Coincidentally, on the same day that potato farmer Jim Stevens was returning to bring Claude supplies, including pistachio pudding and homemade brownies.
Chapter 6. The Murders.
According to Claude Dallas, Game Warden Bill Pogue was surly and itching for a fight from the moment he pulled into Bull Camp.
It was also clear from the start that this was Bill Pogue's operation. The other warden that was with him, Conley Elms, was just along for the ride, purely backup.
Bill Pogue had actually asked several other wardens to accompany him before asking Conley Elms, but they'd all been too busy to make the long trip out to the Nevada border, so fate left it to be Conley, a big bearded guy who sat back and let Bill run the show.
Claude first encountered the two game wardens as he was headed to Jim's truck to retrieve more supplies.
Warden Bill Pogue informed Claude that he'd been informed he was illegally trapping bobcats and was there to investigate the claims.
Claude said, "If you guys came out here 150 miles to give me a citation, I just can't see it."
This apparently pissed Warden Pogue off, who began to scream at Dallas. Then he asked for the .22 pistol in Claude's shoulder holster, which Claude gave to him, though Bill Pogue did not ask for the gun on Claude's hip, a .357 Magnum revolver.
Claude claims that although he was wearing a heavy coat, the bulge of his revolver was apparent, and Pogue must have seen it, and purposely did not ask for it, as he was itching for a gunfight.
Claude also claims that Pogue made a show of displaying a set of handcuffs, and that Warden Pogue unsnapped the security strap from the pistol in his holster and rested his hand on the grip, toying with it, making as if he was going to draw.
Yeah, and later many folks would come forward to confirm that when they'd been stopped and questioned by Bill Pogue for random things like fishing licenses or trap lines, he would always finger his pistol and play with it. A very intimidating habit.
As Game Warden Bill Pogue fidgeted with his pistol, he said, quote, "You can go down easy or go down hard. Makes no difference to me."
Claude says the warden would say this many more times, each time emphasizing the word hard, until Claude came to believe it was a euphemism for dead, and that he began to feel his life was in danger.
Of course, we can't hear Bill Pogue or Conley Elms' side of the story.
When they came to the tent and saw the 3 deer hanging there, Bill Pogue started demanding answers from Claude, who told him he had to eat, that the nearest store was over 100 miles away.
This angered the game warden, who began to shout, attracting the attention of old spud farmer Jim Stevens, who'd been wandering by the river, looking for arrowheads.
Then Conley Elms entered his tent, despite Claude telling them they needed a search warrant, and found the 2 bobcats as well as a raccoon.
Despite saying he'd caught the bobcats a mile and a half south in Nevada, where the season was already underway, Warden Pogue told Claude he was going to be arrested and hauled in. And to be clear, trapping bobcats out of season was just a $130 fine, about the equivalent of a speeding ticket.
Claude told him that he had livestock, his 2 mules, and that they'd die if he was brought in. That all of his equipment was there, everything he owned. He couldn't just leave it. And according to Claude, Warden Pogue simply stated, "You can go hard. We'll just carry you out."
Here's the big question. Did Game Warden Pogue say, quote, "We'll just carry you out," which is tantamount to a death threat? Jim Stevens says he doesn't remember those exact words, but says there was much the 2 men were saying to each other that he missed. He does remember Warden Pogue saying he was going to arrest Claude, though.
And at that point, according to Claude Dallas, Warden Pogue began to draw his gun. And we have only Claude's word on this. Jim Stevens said he was looking away at the river and says he only heard a volley of shots, didn't see who drew or shot first.
According to Claude Dallas, the warden drew first and fired, but missed him. And it was then that he drew his gun and began to fire at the wardens, emptying his revolver into the two of them.
And it is here that sides are taken. Everyone who's ever known Claude Dallas says he is the most honest man they'd ever met, nearly incapable of telling a lie. But those who knew Bill Pogue say that although he could be a hard ass, a stickler for the laws and regulations, and often did rub folks the wrong way, he wouldn't have drawn his weapon on a trapper for illegal hides, wouldn't even have tried to arrest him, and definitely wouldn't have missed his target at point-blank range.
But though Jim Stevens didn't see exactly what happened, that he had turned away and says it was over in a matter of seconds, he did confirm that Warden Pogue had his pistol drawn and in his hand when he died.
Then Claude coldly shot each of the men behind the ear, as if they were animals he'd trapped. His friend, potato farmer and amateur historian Jim Stevens, watching, horrified.
When the smoke cleared, Jim stared dumbfounded at Claude and exclaimed, "Why? Why, Claude, why?"
Claude told him, "I swore I'd never be arrested again. They were going to handcuff me. I know what you think is right, what I think is right, aren't the same. But nobody has the right to come into my camp and violate my rights. In my mind, it's justifiable homicide."
And then things begin to get absolutely bizarre. Jim was in absolute shock and nearly passed out, and Claude was trying to round up the spooked mules and shouting,
"I'm real sorry about doing this to you, Jim. All I ever do is cause people trouble."
Jim told Claude to just take his vehicle and leave him there. But Claude said he couldn't leave his friend abandoned in the deep forest by himself. It just wasn't right.
Claude then ripped the patches off of Warden Pogue's uniform and loaded his corpse up onto the back of a mule and hauled it up the hill to Jim's blazer. Claude then returned and began loading up Conley Elms, though the large warden was too heavy, kept rolling off. So Claude simply cinched a rope to his ankles and began to drag him face down to the river, his clothes tearing and shredding as they went, his pants sliding down to his ankles. By the time Claude was pushing the warden in the river, he was just about naked.
Jim says he was too terrified and in shock to do anything, and was terrified that his friend might turn on him, though Claude reassured him that he'd shoot himself before he shot Jim.
After a half-hearted attempt to clean the crime scene up, burning some evidence, the two men went to Jim's Chevy Blazer, and Claude then had Jim help him load Warden Pogue's body inside, but he'd already grown stiff with rigor mortis, so they had to have his feet hang out the window.
By now the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the two took off into the night. Jim asked where they were headed. Claude told him to the Paradise Bar and George Nielsen.
So weird. Why? Why not just leave the bodies where they were? Why dump one in the river and take the other one with you?
Jim says he wondered if the warden wasn't a trophy Claude Dallas wished to bring back to his father figure George Nielsen, just like the cougar, bobcat, and raccoon pelts he proudly showed off and had him sell for him.
Just as Claude Dallas had brought back his mother a mink pelt as a child, just as Claude had brought George back cougar, bobcat, coyote, and raccoon, so too did he bring the salty old anti-authoritarian iconoclast the body of a government official who tried to impose his will on their freedom.
The warden's corpse was a symbol of overregulation and tyranny, as symbolic of the Wild West as a coyote pelt or a rattlesnake skin.
George welcomed Claude wearily. For all of his bravado and violent anti-government rhetoric, seeing a dead game warden gave him a chill, and he really wasn't looking for trouble this bad, for this was some serious, bad trouble.
George gave Claude his pickup truck, 3 containers of gasoline in the back, enough fuel to get to either Mexico or Canada, and told him he didn't want to know where he was going.
They loaded the body of Warden Bill Pogue into the bed of the pickup truck. Claude told George, "Send word to my parents that I love them," and then headed off into the desert night. It was now midnight, January 6th, 1981.
Chapter 7. On the Run.
I'm aware of the bonds that were created today. When you told me that sure there's a way, the water's so still and my pain has gone away. The air is much cleaner after it rains. Follow my love, the sentence in spring air. Follow the moon into the sun.
The next day, George and Jim went to a lawyer and told them what happened, hoping to get leniency for reporting the crime before it was discovered. Then the lawyer escorted them to the Winnemucca Sheriff's Station to tell their bizarre story of the 2 dead game wardens and their friend Claude Dallas, who'd murdered them.
Soon, sheriff's detectives were pulling into remote Bulls Camp, investigating the crime scene and hauling the body of Warden Conley Elms from the cold, cold river. Since the crime involved interstate travel and flight, the FBI were informed and soon flocking to the area.
As the FBI, various sheriff's departments from Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon, as well as Fish and Game, 2 SWAT teams, and the National Guard swept into desolate Paradise Valley to search for the elusive trapper, the community became incredibly divided.
Many of the locals thought that Warden Bill Pogue had gone there itching for a fight, ready to kill, and had gotten what he deserved, and that men like Claude Dallas should just be left alone to live their lives.
Geneva Holman in Reno, Nevada said,
"I think they sent a gunslinger up there to Bull Camp. You don't travel all the way through that country to give a man a $35 ticket. You got something else in mind."
Frank Nanzel of the FBI says of the public supporting Dallas, "They weren't bad citizens. They were just confused citizens. I don't have hard feelings for the people who were friends with him and who looked me in the eye and said, 'Go to hell.'"
Roadblocks were set up, and anyone with a beard or ponytail was pulled over. One deputy remarking,
"Every hippie is being picked up. It's kind of funny, but kind of sad too."
They found nothing. The area was just so vast and remote. So many canyons, mine shafts, abandoned cabins. As one searcher said, quote, "It'll take a goddamn army to find that asshole."
Many noted how Claude Dallas was in his element, trapping and hunting and living off the land, while the searchers, including many FBI city slickers from Reno, were getting frostbite and blisters. One searcher remarked, "Claude's in his own backyard, and he ain't leaving."
That was not true, however. Claude had actually left the area fairly quickly after burying Bill Pogue's body by a mine shaft and leaving a long, meandering trail meant to throw off search dogs.
Though, incredibly, authorities would somehow never find the body, and the whereabouts of the remains of Bill Pogue would be a mystery until the trial years later.
As lawmen of every conceivable type descended on Paradise Valley to search for Claude Dallas, helicopters and airplanes circling the vast valleys and deserts with infrared cameras, search teams on horses combing the mesas and promontories, SWAT teams in armored vehicles kicking up sand as they raced through the desert, Claude Dallas was escaping west, out of Paradise Valley, into Oregon, then south to where many outlaws go, the Emerald Triangle of Northern California.
Ha ha, of course he was. Claude had a brother doing logging work in Piercy, right on the Humboldt County and Mendocino County border. Some of you may be familiar with Piercy, as it is home to the famous Reggae on the River Music Festival. The first time I came to Humboldt County, California, was to see Jerry Garcia play there for a festival called Electric on the Eel. Smack in the redwoods, a notorious haven for outlaws, where the skills of a mountain man are much beloved in the rugged hills. In many ways, old draft-dodging long-haired Claude fit right in with the rednecks and back-to-the-land hippies.
But Dallas kept on the go, suspecting, correctly, that the law would suspect he was in Northern California with his brother. So he moved on, down to Texas for a bit before swinging up to Northern Michigan and working in a factory for a while. But he always returned to the Ion area, even returning to the Alvord Ranch, having his brother go to Bull Camp itself, hoping to retrieve some supplies he'd left.
Claude just couldn't keep away from the great American desert, each time growing bolder and bolder.
Folks knew when he was around. Most stayed quiet, though a few made whispers that reached the ears of the law, especially as now there was a $20,500 reward out for him.
Chapter 8. Craig Carver.
Some kind of morning feels like the sun never set. Some kind of morning. No, I'm not ready yet, but the hours are few.
Craig Carver was a Paradise Valley resident as reclusive and gun-crazy as Claude. 35-year-old ex-Marine and decorated Vietnam vet who'd once held top security clearance in the government. Craig had decided to drop out of society and live the simple life.
Craig worked as a fence builder, but refused to use modern tools. He wouldn't even use an electric saw, cutting everything by hand, making fences tighter than a violin string.
He lived on a blank piece of desert called Poverty Flats, in a dilapidated trailer on the edge of a junkyard. He was beyond obsessed with guns. They were his life and passion, and he'd come to hate the government.
One night, 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on his trailer door. And who should be on his doorstep but Claude Dallas, a pistol on his side, a rifle in his hand, a duffel bag of clothes at his feet, and a backpack full of books strapped to his shoulders.
Craig didn't ask who'd dropped him off there. Didn't want to know. He greeted him like family, invited him in to sleep on his sofa, fed him. They talked endlessly about guns. Craig didn't ask him where he'd been. He didn't want to know.
Though public support for Dallas was overwhelming in Paradise Valley, and to say a discouraging word about the outlaw was liable to get you into a fist fight, that $20,500 reward proved mighty tempting. And eventually, someone ratted Claude out, calling the FBI and telling them where he was. An old trailer in Poverty Flats, perched on the edge of a junkyard.
The FBI didn't notify local law enforcement until hours before the raid, fearing word would leak out. On the morning of April 18th, 1982, sheriffs in Idaho and state troopers in Nevada were informed and came tearing into Paradise as the FBI readied SWAT teams and a Huey helicopter.
Word among the law enforcement agencies was not to kill him unless absolutely necessary, for he was the only one who knew where Warden Bill Pogue's body was hidden. As bizarre as taking that corpse had seemed, in the end, it was the ace up his sleeve.
It was evening by the time the army of law enforcement were pouring out, headed northeast on Highway 8A, passing George Nielsen's Paradise Bar, swarming Poverty Flats, and quietly establishing a perimeter around the trailer.
And then a huge black Huey helicopter came roaring up over the horizon, barreling at 150 knots, buzzing the trailer and butterflying down to the desert floor. FBI men in SWAT gear leaping off, a voice booming from the speakers.
"This is the FBI. Claude Dallas, come out with your hands up."
Then, from the back of the trailer, Claude Dallas came bursting through the window with a rifle cradled in his arms. He landed on the desert floor in a shower of glass, rolled to a pickup truck, leapt in, took off across the desert, careening past an outhouse and slamming through a barbed wire fence. Total insanity. The sun was setting, and Claude Dallas was speeding away, his truck bouncing and skidding across the rough terrain, law enforcement scrambling to get in their vehicles and give chase.
A little kid came riding over on his bicycle and asked, "What's going on?" An FBI agent holding a submachine gun saying, "Get back!" But the kid just rode over behind some brush and watched as the Wild West antics played out. Claude was headed toward the river, bouncing and skidding, now over a mile away from the trailer. The Huey helicopter swooping down to buzz the truck. Claude poking his rifle out the window and taking shots at it. The helicopter then receiving a transmission saying, green light," meaning they now had permission to open fire on him.
They blasted the truck with a rising submachine gun, hosing off an entire magazine in one long burst.
The truck then slammed through another barbed wire fence. This time, the fencing going under the hood and ripping off the battery cables, causing the truck to stall and begin rolling to a stop.
Claude then dove from the truck with his 30-06 clutched in his hands, crawling into some brush.
Nevada state troopers perched high on a bluff watching the valley with binoculars radioed in that Dallas had left his vehicle and was crawling away, and SWAT teams moved in on their hands and knees, taking cover in the sagebrush and dunes.
When they were about 60 feet away from the stalled truck, a voice called out, "Don't shoot! I'm over here."
An FBI agent then pointed an M16 at Claude Dallas and ordered him not to move. Claude responded,
"I'm not gonna do anything."
And then they had their man. After nearly a year and a half, the elusive mountain man and outlaw, trapper and symbol of the wild American West, was in custody. He'd been shot in the right ankle just below the calf, shrapnel from the car door embedded in his flesh as well.
Chapter 9. The Trial.
In a far-off western country, where friends are few and dear, where cattle roam in thousands and the skies are always clear, we were rounding up one morning when the work was nearly done, when the cattle all stampeded in a wild and maddened run. 'Twas the boss's little daughter was holding scarlet blanket.
Claude was air transported to the hospital in Reno, where his ankle wound was treated. It ended up being relatively minor.
There was so much fear that locals from Paradise Valley might try to ambush law enforcement to free him, as well as fear that a vigilante posse might want to lynch him, that Claude Dallas was transported to Murphy, Idaho, in a 26-foot Winnebago filled with sheriffs in flak jackets with M16s.
A defense fund was started by a Reno banker and his wife, who loved to hunt and had met Claude at the Paradise Bar.
Yeah, at the bar, this banker and his wife happened to say they sure wish they had some Idaho potatoes. And polite and courteous Claude put a 100-pound sack of potatoes in their truck for them.
To them, Claude exemplified everything they loved about the American West: independence, free spirit, ruggedness, and truth. And Warden Pogue represented everything they hated: rules and regulations, tyranny and despotism. They put up $1,000 each, and soon flyers and jars were going around Paradise, and then in South Carolina, where Claude Sr. was living, and Texas, where one of Claude's brothers was. Funds poured in from all over the country.
Claude really lucked out with his lawyer, Michael Donnelly, a whiz with legal precedent, who had him plead not guilty to murder, called it justified homicide. And he turned the trial not into one against Claude, but against game warden Bill Pogue.
After 15 years of being with Fish and Game, Bill Pogue had developed quite the reputation for being a hard ass and gained a lot of enemies. Truth was, he was an environmentalist and conservationist, trying to protect the public lands which he fiercely loved. He adored the desert, loved nature, and in particular loved Oahe, wanted to be buried out there.
But he was gruff, surly, and had the intimidating habit of fingering his weapon when he talked to folks, jiggling his service revolver and hefting its weight, while demanding to see someone's fishing license, treating everyone as a potential criminal, ripping out folks' legitimate trap lines when he couldn't find them to demand their license. He was widely hated, and folks weren't afraid to come to court and testify as such.
Then character witness after character witness came to swear what an upstanding, polite, quiet, respectful, and honest man Claude Dallas was.
The court was filled with supporters, even a group of women who called themselves, wait for it, the Dallas cheerleaders.
Oh, God. That's rough. Then Claude himself took the stand, appearing thoughtful, gentle, articulate, and intelligent. He spoke of his love of the great outdoors and the American West, his desire to live in the wild, then gave his tale of self-defense, saying he'd shot the game wardens because he was in fear for his life.
And when it came to Bill Pogue's body, which still had not been recovered, his wife agonizing over not knowing where it was, Claude ended all that vitriol by revealing right there on the stand where he'd buried it and marking the spot on a map with an X. Investigators driving out and finding the remains right near where they'd originally searched with cadaver dogs.
Most of the jury ate it all up, finding Claude Dallas to be sensitive, an honest man just trying to live his life, not the psycho killer the prosecution tried to paint him as. There was only one problem: the execution-style shots behind the ear. Shooting the wardens in the head after they were down spoke of something cold inside him. Overkill.
For his part, Claude said he didn't know why he did it. Some strange instinct had just taken over him.
While most of the jury wanted to acquit him on justified homicide, there was one holdout for murder, saying he'd killed an officer of the law and needed to be punished, wondering what kind of example they'd be setting if they let a murderer go. Eventually, a compromise was made of voluntary manslaughter.
So the jury found Claude guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a much lesser charge than murder, and then sentencing was put into the hands of the judge. Would he be lenient? Would he buy Claude's claims of self-defense?
By all appearances, it seemed so. The judge seemed amicable to Claude and the defense in general, often taking their side in matters of legal precedent.
During the break between the trial and the sentencing, many were surprised when Claude was released on bail. This notorious outlaw and killer was allowed to go free, wandering out into Paradise Valley to hunt and trap. And many worried he would not return. But he came back, just as he promised. Claude Dallas was always good to his word.
The jovial, friendly judge told Claude he'd judged him to be an honest and good person, that he believed all the character witnesses who testified to his behalf. But the judge said he didn't buy Claude's claims of self-defense. He stated that he doubted Warden Pogue wanted a gunfight and execution with not one but two witnesses, the other warden and Jim Stevens. And he seriously doubted that if Warden Pogue had shot first, he would have missed, especially from point-blank range.
And so the judge told him, though he meant it as no strike against his character, he had no choice but to give Claude the maximum penalty of 30 years.
Claude's friends and supporters were aghast. They'd been sure he'd get a light sentence and hoped to be celebrating with Claude soon. But that was that. There was nothing they could do but appeal, which they did and lost.
But if you think this tale of American Wild West outlaws versus a cold justice system was over there, you are seriously wrong. You know it always gets weirder and weirder on the murder coaster, and it's about to get crazier.
Chapter 10. Escape. On March 30th, 1986, Easter Sunday, Claude escaped state prison, cutting through two fences and escaping into the same desert as in 1981.
You cannot keep this guy down. Love him or hate him. What an American icon.
The prison break itself is a mystery. Many claim that he didn't cut through the fences like prison officials claim, saying he simply walked out the front door with a group of visitors. There was a large-scale investigation, but in the end it came up inconclusive. Regardless of how he escaped, Claude Lafayette Dallas was free.
The FBI, who'd worked so hard capturing this guy, were obviously pissed, and his escape landed him on the 10 most wanted list.
Claude hoofed it down to Mexico, where he got some plastic surgery, but that didn't stop him from being spotted a year later, eating peanut butter outside a 7-Eleven in the most unlikely places of Riverside, California. Urban Southern California seems anathema to a mountain man, but maybe he thought that would hide him?
When authorities searched his motel room, they found nothing. No guns, no traps, no crazy books on being on the run. Suspiciously, nothing, leading them to believe he must have had another safe house in the area, though it was never discovered.
Claude claimed he escaped because prison guards were trying to kill him and he feared for his life. He went to trial and was found innocent on his escape charges, completely exonerated and acquitted.
Wow, just wow. It's fucking crazy. He went back to prison and he quietly served his time. He was released in 2005 after serving 22 years, having 8 years shaved off for good behavior. And today, Claude Dallas lives deep in the forest of Washington State.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Claude Dallas, mountain man and outlaw, iconic symbol of the American West, hated by some, loved by many. And we hope you enjoyed his story.
It's fucking crazy, huh?
Yeah.
And do you have a story you'd like us to cover? Let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
Later.